And it's time to get you another big voice on the channel. A very, very rare one. Gautam Kumra, managing partner for McKinsey and Company India, sat down with Ajaya Sharma to analyze the slowdown in the economy and what steps should the stakeholders take in order to achieve that very ambitious target of $5 trillion for the Indian economy. He also talks about the exciting startup opportunity in India. Here's a slice of that exclusive.
Let me refer to a very significant piece of research that our McKinsey Global Institute has done over the last 5 years, looking at about 90 countries around the world and studying their per capita GDP growth rate for 50 years. What we discovered was there were 18 countries out of the 90 that we call outperformers. When I say outperformers, I mean they substantially overshot the average per capita GDP growth rates. If you look at these 18, they come in two brackets. One is about 11 countries that have been, I would say, recent outperformers. So in fact, India is one of them, Vietnam is one of them. There are about another 7 countries that I would say are long-term outperformers. So think about Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan. So we analyzed all of these and looked at what is underlying that. And I think one of the things you find is that, as you would expect, the outperforming 18 markets, right, have basically created a virtuous cycle of demand, income, and productivity. A virtuous cycle of demand, income, and productivity. And if you push at the core of it, let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk a little bit about each one of them. You see, you take productivity, for example, which I think in many ways is one of the most key determinants of economic growth rate. If India has to get to a $5 trillion economy from 2.7, we need about 8.1% CAGR, economic growth rate. And if you look at the employee participation rate, that will be about 2%. So 6% has to come from productivity growth. Now, if you look at and analyze productivity growth and you break it down into agriculture, manufacturing, services, a 6% productivity growth rate cannot be achieved unless the mix of GDP shifts substantially in favor of manufacturing. And our sense is that over the next, by 2024, if we want to get to, for example, a $5 trillion economy, we need to add at least 5% GDP points more to the mix of manufacturing in the sector. Otherwise, you just don't get there.
So Gautam, I'm quite surprised to see right now when we speak to a lot of corporates, the asset utilization at their company levels is very low because demand is not there.
That's right.
And till the capacity utilization goes up or hits the roof, there would be no need for going for fresh capex. Plus, the cost of capital has been elevated in our country for the last couple of years.
It's been a challenge,
which is maybe generally coming down.
That's right.
But what comes first, the chicken or the hen? What comes first? Do they go and wait for the demand to come, or they prepare about creating extra capacities? How will India come out of this kind of a trap which we have gotten ourselves into?
Yeah, no, I think you raise a good point. I think, but there is no shying away from the fact that fundamentally, I think the rate at which capital formation is occurring in the country is way lower than what it needs to be. You see, you look at China, just over the last growth rate. If you look at the rate of capital formation in that country has gone from 30% to 45% over that period. We are still hovering at about 30, right? I think, so we cannot wish away the fact that even income increase, which is fundamentally a function of number of jobs and quality of jobs, is in fact linked to investments, because at the end of the day, it's not the government that is going to create all those jobs. So I think no matter how we look at it, we have to unlock the investment cycle, right, which will actually yield productivity increase, because as I said earlier, a lot of the productivity increase is also a function of capital formation. The income increase, which is a function of wage growth, and employment creation, which is a function of investments. So no matter how we look at it, we have to unlock that cycle. And I think the issue there, in my view, has not been, despite the current liquidity and credit issues, the issue has not been the lack of capital. Because globally there has been enough capital, but we have not been able to clear and put a framework together where we can attract that capital, and the capital can go to many other parts of the world.
Sure. Because there is a race for global capital right now, and you have to show your attractiveness, only then will it really turn up at your doorstep. Otherwise, there are so many, competition is very high.
Yes, and that's where we fall down.
So when you were studying the models of economies which have really broken out of the emerging market and have turned into large economies successfully, how has the partnership from the government and corporate or the private side has been? Who plays what kind of role in your view for the country's size of the economy in aggregate to go higher?
Yes. You see, I'd say a few things. Firstly, the private firms, I think we are of the firm view that building large competitive firms is a critical ingredient to long-term, sustained, accelerated economic growth rate. I'll give you some numbers. If you look at, again, India versus China, and you look at just number of large firms. So number of large firms defined as, let's say, a firm greater than $500 million in top line. Sure. Today, China is about 5 times the number of large firms compared to India. If you look at the revenues of these large firms as a share of GDP, today in India it's about 40%. So all large firms put together represent about 40% of our Indian GDP. Same in China is at about 70%. If I project the movie forward, for us to be a $5 trillion economy, and for us to, if you do some basic benchmarking, we need to be able to take the number of large firms in this country from 500 to 2,500.
Yeah.
So we have to generate another 2,000 large firms, in our view, to really establish that kind of economic growth rate. Now, this will only happen if more of the MSMEs become bigger and if more of the mid-sized firms become large firms. And that cycle in India is not working as well as it should. In fact, the number of firms that are becoming in this large circuit every year has actually been stagnant in India for the last 5 years.
I mean, we are just 2.5% of global market cap and barely 2 companies in the $100 billion club.
Absolutely.
But do you see that MSMEs, actually you put a very interesting point forward, that this MSME and SME structure of the economy have efficiency issues, productivity issues, and access of capital. And whatever capital they do, they get not at the best of rates, right?
Absolutely.
So how do you think these guys will really come up the size curve, or how will their businesses actually become large if these 4 shackles they have to face with, in your view?
Well, this is where I'll tell you, this is where the market has to clear, because I think the reality is that when you benchmark, I think large firms, in our logic, compared to the MSMEs, are 10 to 15 times more productive. Okay. Right? And I think if it's a game about productivity, then you have to fix the composition of each and every sector. So fundamentally, Ajay, where it goes down to is you have to go and look within each sector, construction, oil and gas, electronics manufacturing, and you have to challenge what is the right competitive industry structure to create. So we have to make it a playing field where the smaller companies are encouraged to actually become large, and frankly, doing business and being large is not considered bad.
So scale should be incentivized in your view?
Absolutely. I think scale should be incentivized, because let's not forget, the other thing we didn't talk about is that it's not about domestic demand alone. Ultimately, it's about also being able to tap into export markets. Recognizing the contraction in global trade we are facing right now, there is no doing away that none of those countries that I mentioned became an outperformer without also having a substantial play in the export market.
So broadly, if in that journey of an emerging market becoming a large market, what's the role of exports? Because we are less than 20% of the 15% odd is exports, right? How does that proportion, domestic versus export, actually change in the evolution of economy in your view?
You see, the reality is that if you look at, ultimately, my view is that when we make in India, if you have to increase the share of manufacturing GDP in India from 1920, whatever it is, to 25, 26, you see, you need to invest for the world. Sure. I think you need to access the global markets, because it is a game for scale and competitiveness, and I think you don't need to restrict it to serving only the home market. And frankly, while if you look at, compared to China, if you look at just home market alone, we are way behind. We are 1/5, 1/7 in almost every sector you look at. So I think for us to make the economics effective, we need to create the conditions for investments in India to be globally competitive and serve the global markets.
So when you analyze the entire landscape, which other sectors do you think hold scope for expansion, this global trade which you're talking about, in an overall environment where, because of tariffs, etc., the size of the pie is shrinking? Because right now, IT exports, pharma, maybe gems and jewelry is at the best we have done.
Sure. No, you're right. Those are great examples, by the way. I think I'm just 30 seconds on the sectors you mentioned. I think the world top 3 players, I believe in the next 20 years, many of them will be from India, whether it's in IT, whether it's in generics, pharmaceutical manufacturing, and so forth. But I look at many of the sunrise sectors. I mean, why are we not, for example, being more aggressive in electronics manufacturing? Why are we not taking a stake in battery manufacturing? Why are we not putting a bigger stake in renewables? Whether it's solar panels and so forth. So I look at sunrise sectors, right? Sectors that are still, the growth is going to unfold over the next 20 years. Now, I think if you take a couple of these areas, but go beyond looking at just the direct project, but also the entire ecosystem. So if I think about electric mobility, we should look at how can we really think about the mobility solution for the consumer and create amazing demand by thinking about solutions at a much lower and a different price point and look at the entire value chain, right? So I mean, so all of these areas I actually think are absolutely still up for grabs.
That was a rare interview with McKinsey and Company. You never see them talking. 5 trillion aim will be achieved. Large firms, more incentives need to be given. That was some of the key takeaways. But through the day, we will be playing out this introduction. You can also catch it on our digital portal as well. Leaving you with the Nifty up about 100 odd points, taking a break. Markets are looking fine today, taking a break. Coming back later.